Welcome to the More to Story podcast. I am glad that you have come along, and I think some of you are going to have some questions answered that you've had since you were children on today's podcast. I'm excited to talk to our guest in just a minute, but this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. We do that through a host of programs, all sorts of academic programs, certificate programs, lay initiatives like the Wesley Institute. There are several of those coming about here soon. I'm coming to you right now in the summer, in June of 2025. And so people are getting ready, particularly for the fall academic semester, where we have a Wesley Institute that starts in September, that goes through every book of the Bible with seminary professors teaching those books. And then another track, a theology track, where we go through theological disciplines. And then we'll have several other short Wesley Institutes happening this fall as well. So check that out at our website at wbs.edu. We're also in a unique position as we are one of the first institutions approved by the recommended by the Global Methodist Church. And that has led us to a place where I serve as president at WBS. And at this time, it's a wild time of leadership as we have added 430 students in the last year and a half to our student body from the Global Methodist Church. So about 580 students with about 500 churches represented all over the world. So it's our privilege to serve those churches through the pastors that we're training at this time. So you can find out more about us at wbs.edu. And I love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. And when you do that, I'll send you a tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And also, there is a new page there that has various courses that are available, small group courses. There's a course on heaven. There's a course on the book of Jude, which we'll probably talk about today. And then we're also going to, there's a course on the doctrine of holiness. So I'd love for you to check that out at my website. Okay. I'm so glad to welcome in the podcast Dr. Joan Taylor, who's an emeritus professor from King's College in the UK, and she's also taught at various places, but now is coming to my office via Zoom from New Zealand. Joan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy.
I'm excited to see your book. I saw it in the Zondervan catalog. I might be backwards for people as I'm holding up here, but it's called Boy Jesus, Growing Up Judean in Turbulent Times. And this kind of falls in line with some of your other research that you've done, a book on what Jesus would have looked like and various other things connected to that time period. So I'm just really interested in how this book came about, particularly at this stage in your academic and writing career.
Yeah, good question. I think I just thought, as a mother, having children, how important childhood is, and how much it's been really omitted from the quest of the historical Jesus, that historical Jesus scholars have just jumped over Jesus' childhood. And if you look at so many books on the historical Jesus, it's basically you get the idea that everything is mythological in Luke 1-2 and Matthew 1-2. And the early church just made the stuff up because it suited a proclamation about Jesus as Messiah. And the only thing that's really reliable is from the time of John the Baptist, that Jesus' baptism in the Jordan. And I just thought, well, hold on, even if we thought that, even if we went that far, still there's a historical context that Jesus would have grown up with that would have had a huge impact on him in terms of his identity, in terms of his family, in terms of what he thought about the world. So even if we go to the most skeptical position, it's important. But I have never felt that there was, that you could just completely overlook everything in the nativity accounts. And I know I did that with John the Baptist when I first wrote my book on John the Baptist, and many years ago, when I looked at the historical John the Baptist, I did jump over his nativity account.
Oh, interesting.
In Luke. But shortly after writing the book, actually, I went back to that account and I thought, hold on, I've probably made a mistake. I probably should have written more about it. And so it really started off with me thinking about John the Baptist nativity and then going into Jesus.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, this is one of those questions that a lot of folks have. We have some material, of course, in Luke, which I hope we'll talk about here, that give us some details of Jesus as a boy. But really, there's this huge gap, which leads questions. But you're not necessarily trying to say, well, this is what some of the ancient legends were about what Jesus did, performing magic tricks and the like, but really trying to give not just credibility, but look at the historical reliability and what this says about the not just the gospel accounts, but how various ancient sources, I don't want to say back up, but give us a better picture of who Jesus was as a boy.
Well, yes. And I started to think a lot about memory and how memory is transmitted. There's been a real interest in memory studies in New Testament scholarship, in terms of how early Christian memories are shaped and then reshaped and then finally written down, and then that then becomes a resource to have new memories, and it keeps on going and going. So that idea of there being memories, you have to ask, where do those memories come from? And it's not, I think, a case of the New Testament authors having license to just make things up out of nothing. That wasn't the kind of world we're in the ancient world.
Yeah.
And I'm not a person that believes every word of the Bible has to be factually correct. I think that I'm not in that particular group, but I am not in the group of the skeptics that think people had free reign, individualistic free reign to just go, I think I'll just make up a whole lot of stuff about Jesus as a child. I don't think that's how it worked in the ancient world. So somewhere we're in a place where there are these genuine memories. There are people that say, hey, I've got a story, and it's received by someone and they go, well, that's a very meaningful story. I'm going to write it down. And there may be some shaping of that story, but there's a fundamental core of truth to it that historians have to recognize. So, and that's true in terms of storytelling too. We get a story told to us by someone. If you think about how we tell stories, that's the world of oral storytelling we're in, that things are being passed on. And what I say is in the book is that the stories in the Gospel of Matthew, really, the clues are that they come from Jesus' own family.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I can't help but just jump into that with the idea of how memories are then written down and then shared, in part because I read your book from the beginning to the end. I'm going to jump to the end. So you'll just have to excuse me.
Right.
But I think it's really interesting. You have a chapter on Jesus in the temple, and you reflect on that via Mary's, that this is a perspective of Mary's memory. And so some of the questions that some people have, like, how could this happen? Like, how, or what was going on? What do we learn about Jesus in this passage? But that you position it as something coming from Mary, and that that kind of like affects some of the way that we understand those facts.
Well, yeah. So to me, it's a very curious little snippet. I talk about these little snippets, and that we've got the main thrust of the nativity account, which is incredibly miraculous. Gabriel arriving with Mary, and it's all incredibly beautiful. And shepherds and angels in the field, and all of this very theological style of Luke 1 to 2. And then suddenly we have the story of Jesus coming with his parents to the temple when he's 12 years old, and this is really major, and they're taking him from Nazareth to Jerusalem, and essentially he gets lost. And I think, so many parents have these stories about children. I have stories about children.
Me too. Yeah.
I couldn't find my child. This sort of, well, there was a crowd. I couldn't find them, and it seems a very authentic kind of story that would have been told by parents. And really, what's fascinating is how incredibly different it is from what has just gone before. It's like, I'm going to stick the story in because it's going to be meaningful in terms of talking about Jesus as being in his Father's house. But the core of the story is Jesus was not with the caravan going back to Nazareth after they had been at the temple for Passover. And he was hanging out with the teachers in the area of the temple where the teachers were freely speaking to the crowds. And we know that sort of area existed in Solomon's portico. It would have been covered, it would have been dry, food would have been passed around. It was a very good place for a lost child to be in the temple. And also the significance of the Passover at that time. I can imagine that it was very significant that Jesus was learning things and wanted to understand what was going on. But what I love is the reaction of Joseph and Mary is that it's not like they go back and go, of course you had to be in your Father's house. We know you've got a great mission. You were announced by angels in the field. It's like, we were looking for you everywhere. Did you not understand? Yeah. You should have been really at coming in the caravan. And that's a very real response of parents to a lost child. So I love that. I think that indicates there's some sort of core story that Jesus really did stay in the temple when his parents joined the caravan back to Nazareth. And they went a long time because they were in a huge group of people heading home.
Yeah, you show how one historian talked about there being more than 2 million people who would have come in that period. So it's not like it's not just as simple as me walking into a grocery store and losing my kids. Maybe that has happened. But anyhow, so but it's interesting. Yeah. Now you also bring in another source, the Padika, right? That maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong. And that also another ancient source that talks about this same story, but has different details as well.
Yeah, the Padika, the Gospel of Thomas, it replicates the same story. It's slightly different in terms of its nuances, and it seems like, well, the question is, did the Padika get it from Luke, or did Luke get it from the Padika, or did they both get it from another source? And really, textual scholars are better at that than me. But it shows that the story was knocking around independently. I think that's the key thing.
Gotcha. But a lot of people assume that Luke, who wants to make an orderly account of the events around Jesus, seemingly interviewed people who would have been aware of the story. And I've just heard people say this. I don't know how reliable it is, but also the idea that he could have interviewed Mary.
Well, that's true. We don't know anything about how old Mary was when she died, actually. The traditional stories are, the Dormition, she's in Jerusalem, there's the disciples around her. But how old was she? And certainly she was said to be around the time of the Pentecost experience. She was there in the upper room. And so we imagine her having some influence and telling her stories for some time, but how long we don't know. Certainly the idea of an ancient historian and the writer of the Gospel of Luke presents himself as an ancient historian. That's the way we've got in the Gospel of Luke in the prologue. They would have done their homework. Anyone writing history would have done their homework. And we know from, for example, the Bishop of Hierapolis in the 2nd century, Papias, when he talks about trying to get reliable material about Jesus, he says, he wanted to find disciples of Jesus. He interviewed the elder John, whoever the elder John is, however we construct the elder John. And he was interested in the fact that Mark had written down the memories of Peter. And that's a good example of how they valued the idea of memories being passed on. He says about Mark, he wrote them down, but not in the right order. And I think that's sort of what was the right audience for atheists, Mark. Yeah, so we have the sense that they were interested in getting reliable evidence.
Yeah. Okay, I went to the end of the book. Now I want to go back to the beginning. And this was a helpful chapter to me because it's probably easy in English translation just to think, well, Jesus is simply Jewish. But you help us see kind of three layers to this that have deeper dimensions than just say a mere religious identity. Help us understand those distinctions.
Yeah, so the Greek word is Judaios, and it's usually translated as Jew.
Mm-hmm.
But there are points where in our text that doesn't quite work. We know this actually from a lot of work on the Gospel of John, where the Judaioi appear as an authority group, and they seem to be the Judean authorities, the authorities for this nation of Judea. So I wanted to look into Judaios as a Judean, as well as belonging to a nation, as belonging to a geographical zone that you could talk about as Judea. Someone would go into Judea and out of Judea, and in fact we have that in the Acts of the Apostles. So that gives you an identity as a Judean. You belong to a particular nation, region, culture. And that is what I really wanted to explore in terms of Jesus, because he's a Judean who then goes to Galilee with his family and grows up as a Galilean, but he's ultimately a Judean from that area around Jerusalem, old Judea. And as well as that, I wanted to explore the fact that he had a Judahite ancestry, and that's very clear in our genealogies of Jesus. And that is also part of what a Judaios was in Greek. You were a Judahite, and that you were descended from the patriarch Judah. So Jesus is descended from Judah and descended from David in terms of his genealogy. So all of these dimensions of what it means to be this term Judaios, I felt needed to be explored, not just the religious aspect of being Jewish.
How could that help us as we read scripture, particularly to understand this? I mean, you open with a really interesting story that unfolding of John 4, which I think is really helpful. But for instance, like those distinctions don't leap out at us in English translations, but I'm curious how that might help us in our own reading of scripture.
Yes, it's really thinking about Jesus' identity at these points where we have him facing up with the Samaritan woman in John 4, and she goes, "Whoa, you're different from me," and he goes, "Whoa, you're different from me," and there's this sense of the disciples going, "Why is he talking? Why is he even talking to a woman?" But it's that sense of she's a Samaritan and he's a Judean. And it means something in terms of region and culture and religious identity, all kind of meshed into one. And so he can stand in the fact that he is a Judean. He knows he is a Judean and actually thinks in terms of the Messiah, the Judean Messiah being the important identity that she should be looking towards as well. Salvation comes from the Judeans. And so reading it in terms of a kind of identity politics is really interesting in terms of where you're situated. And likewise with the Syro-Phoenician woman in Mark, and the sense of Jesus is encountering this other, this woman, you might call her Lebanese on today's understanding, and the Syro-Phoenicians actually were those who owned Galilee, that was their territory for centuries and centuries until Judeans conquered Galilee in the really mostly in the early 1st century BCE. So the Syro-Phoenicians were very much around and about, as were the Syro-Palestinians, the Palestinians around Judea and Samaria, and Jesus encounters this woman and says, he was sent. to Israel. He wasn't sent to the
Right. Sure.
Syrophoenicians.
Sure.
His concern,
Yeah. Yeah.
his whole identity is about Israel. And she says, well, you're an amazing healer. Look, my daughter is sick. Do it for me.
Yeah. Sure.
And pushes back at him and convinces him that, faith is something that it can be found outside Israel. And her daughter is healed. So it's a very interesting story that Jesus himself was open to being corrected, really, by a woman from outside Israel.
And she was willing to, you highlight this as well, accept the way that the order kind of how things were working, even though she challenged it.
In terms of, you come first to feed Israel, but she takes on board a slur, the idea that those outside your ethnic group can be called dogs.
Right.
It's a terrible, terrible slur. It's a horrible thing to call people outside your group, the others, as dogs. And that's a term still used today. In fact, in the Middle East and elsewhere, you call people outside your group dogs. And she goes, well, even the little dogs, they eat what's under the children's table. And and he goes, okay, whoa, I can't just draw a hard line around Israel. There is a kind of sequence of things, and I'm going to sort of push that sequence forward. And actually, that's already there in Isaiah anyway, that the nations would join with Israel and come to the mountain of the Lord. That is, and Jesus is, I see, very much as on a project already started by Isaiah. He's sort of a continuation of what Isaiah predicted.
Yes. Yeah. That's really helpful. One of the things that the quest for the historical Jesus, when I particularly think about the influence of the Jesus Seminar, is this move away from thinking that Jesus as the son of David or the seed of David isn't anything that's historical or genealogically significant. It's just a marker to give him a messianic authority. But you really work against that thesis.
Yeah, I totally work against that thesis.
That's a nice way of saying it. You slam it, I should say. Yeah.
I probably said that myself, in historical Jesus classes that I've taught for years and years. I was like, well, we can't really know that. And so I know what they say. And it's really based on this idea of whoever would possibly know their genealogy could be traced to David in the 1st century BC. It's so many centuries before, just
right.
You couldn't remember it, and a lot of these things are symbolic and it doesn't really matter. But actually, it does matter. Where I am in New Zealand, for Māori in New Zealand, the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, what genealogy, whakapapa as it's called, is absolutely vital. And I actually was looking at a documentary just quite recently about a very influential Māori woman leader, Fina Cooper. And she says in the documentary how when she was a child, her father, who was a chief, drummed into her, this is what you have to remember in terms of your ancestry. And she went through it. It's all oral. I was descended from this person, they were descended from that person, and they would go all the way back, huge number of generations. And so that idea that children are drilled in their genealogy is part of indigenous culture, and it can be part of other cultures as well. So who are we, Western scholars with our individualistic, written word concentration, to think that oral history isn't going to preserve a genealogy? And maybe it even preserves multiple genealogies. We've got 2 genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke. But the point is the genealogy itself. And the genealogy gives you the sense of identity of where you sit within your family, within your tribe, within your village, It is a huge identity marker. So it's not the case that who could have remembered it. All sorts of people would have recited their genealogy, and in fact, that's what we're told about the relatives of Jesus in early church writings. Julius Africanus talks about the relatives of Jesus going around the churches and basically insisting on their genealogy, that they are descended from David and they have a right because of that to administer rule over the churches.
I recall a story as I was doing research on the book of Jude. I've written a little kind of pastoral volume on Jude. The story of Jude's grandsons.
Yes, exactly.
And
so
how,
that's the,
you can go ahead and tell it. Yeah.
well, no, you tell. But
well, just how they, the emperor was worried because here these people were claiming Davidic lineage, and then also the connection to Jesus. So Jesus would have been like an uncle to them. And so are these people going to come take over? And I remember finding a line in the Ante-Nicene Fathers. It was the translation was a little funny, but it was something like he wasn't worried because their hands were calloused.
Yes.
And they were woodworkers. Yeah. And so like he sent them away because they were no threat to him, essentially.
Exactly. They say, look, we've only got this much land. It's not very much land, and they go, okay, they can't raise an army, so we're going to be okay with them. But it's one of these stories that I love because it shows a sort of detail that it wouldn't be a story that you just make up, that they are really concerned to show that they are not at all high princes who have the money to fight against Rome. And it shows Roman worries about the lineage of David. And in fact, in early church writers like Hegesippus and Julius Africanus, they say, Hegesippus says that Vespasian sought out the line of David and wanted to stamp it out. So, quite apart from the story of Herod and the massacre of the innocents, the Romans were on this project of trying to stamp out the line of David. And you have to see Herod as a Roman client king who is interested in going forward with the Roman project, which means quashing any opposition, any Judean opposition to the rule of Augustus.
Yeah, thinking of that period, and this is part of your subtitle, right? That this is a turbulent time. So tell us about like why you use that language to describe Jesus's childhood, the things that are going on politically and socially around him.
Right. So we're in a Roman world. The Romans had grabbed hold of Judea and its wider Judea and Judea. The Romans just wanted the Pax Romana, the peace, but that meant on Roman terms, and it meant getting a lot of taxes from the areas that they controlled that they could then whoosh back to Rome and wider states in the area of Italy, and everything was this kind of peaceful flow of trade, as long as everyone knew their place and the Romans were in charge, and it was all about a huge money-making power exercise for the honor of Rome and the Roman gods. So you had to remember also that Augustus, the emperor, was a god. Herod, client ruler of Judea, was a Roman appointment, and he was appointed as king of the Judeans when he didn't have any background in terms of his ethnicity as Judean. His father was an Idumean, his mother was Nabatean. And so we've got this sense of Herod coming in as a Roman appointment, doing the Roman thing. He builds a massive temple to the Emperor Augustus in Caesarea so that he can be worshipped as a god in Caesarea. And at the same time, and he builds other temples of Augustus and Panias and in Sebaste in Samaria. But he also builds a lot in terms of the temple in Jerusalem to stay in with his people. But he's not liked, and he's very much seen as a Roman appointment. and he rules with an iron hand. He's got this grip on Judea. He gets a lot of taxes from the Judeans to build magnificent palaces and these great edifices. But he's, I think, very troubled by the idea of there being a hope in a Davidic king arising from the Judeans. He's read Ezekiel 34 to 37. He knows all the prophetic statements about the Judean king arising, the anointed one, the Messiah. And he knows about Micah 5 and the hopes of Bethlehem.
Yeah,
and
sure.
he himself has a project to keep that Davidic hope in line.
Yeah, with that, one of the pieces that's often brought up as if there's not a historical basis for it is what's described in Matthew of Herod's actions towards the children, the babies in Bethlehem. And most of like sometimes people kind of shoo that away because it parallels what happens in Exodus. But you kind of still help us see that there's a historical core to this.
Yes. So I'm not dismissing that there's a lot of Pharaoh in the way Herod is presented. And there is that story interwoven. But that was to give it meaning to people that would go at the time, oh boy, doesn't this sound like Exodus to us? This is very significant. But that doesn't mean it's made up out of nothing. It was actually a meaning overlay that people were going to go, oh, ping, yeah, I know. Ooh, he's very much like Moses. This is what God does in these sorts of instances. But we know of a story actually from Josephus where Herod, he's appointed by the Romans, but then he can't really take charge because, this is the geopolitics of the ancient world. The Parthians, who are from present-day Iran, think present-day Iran, okay. They are the new generation of the Persians. They back a rival king in Jerusalem, Antigonus Mattathias. So this is all told by the historian Josephus. In 40 BCE, the Parthian-backed Antigonus Mattathias comes into Jerusalem and takes over. And there's a lot of Judeans that far prefer him to the Roman-backed Herod. They want Antigonus. And those Judeans are apparently just around the area of Bethlehem, because when Herod flees from Jerusalem at that time, when the Parthians take over, the people of the area around Bethlehem attack Herod. And you imagine a lot of young men going out and thinking, we're not even going to let him escape, this Roman guy. And he's trying to leave with all of his garrison, and Herod is fleeing to the south. We know the road goes straight past Bethlehem. He manages to get a little bit past Bethlehem at this place that later becomes called Herodion. And he's attacked there, and he utterly massacres the Judeans who attack him. So Herod does massacre a whole lot of young men of this area in 40 BCE. And in fact, the memory of that is so important that Herod builds a fortress, a village and a fortress, and ultimately his own tomb on the site of the hill right next to where the massacre took place, and calls it Herodium, his place. And he ends up being buried there in this massive, mausoleum that is 25 meters high. And how is it positioned? It's positioned right looking over Bethlehem, like this giant finger on the hill, looking right down at Bethlehem. So Herod has business with Bethlehem and those who remember David in Bethlehem, and he has business with people who attacked him. He's angry with these people, and in fact, he goes in 10 BCE, according to Josephus, and he desecrates the tomb of David in Jerusalem. He goes in and takes remaining treasure from the tomb. He breaks in with his men even to the tomb chamber of David and Solomon lying there where their sarcophagi are. And there's a miraculous event where fire bursts out from the tomb and his men are injured, and then he scurries away, as told by Josephus. But the important thing is he builds a massive monument outside that tomb, a huge white monument outside that tomb. So he stamps himself on the tomb of David in Jerusalem architecturally. And that monument is probably very similar to the monument in Herodion of his own tomb. So Herod makes this claim to, like, whoa, you remember David, but I'm the legitimate king. I was appointed by the Romans, who are ultimately doing the will of God. I'm put there in place by the will of God. So it's all this dynamic between Herod and those who had the memory of David. And I think we see that in the story of Matthew. It's assumed we kind of know that.
Interesting. So that would be within a decade then of that event when he goes to David's tomb, where he comes back.
Absolutely within a few years. If we, Herod is now thought to have died in 4 BCE. I use BCE rather than before Christ, because it sort of doesn't make sense if you talk about Jesus being born likely in 6 BCE, BC, in the final years of Herod. So it's only a few years after Herod has desecrated the tomb. And I should say archaeologically, we do know that there were memories of people who identified as from the tomb, people who identified as coming from the line of David, because in Givat HaMivtah, an ossuary has been found in which it's written on the side, from the house of David, from the it is there. That this person was buried there, and they knew that they were from the house of David.
This is so fascinating to be able to pull in all these extra details. Thank you so much for all this work that you've done. One other contribution, I hope we talk as long as we can here. Contribution I think you make that's, I think distinct, particularly thinking about Jesus' boyhood, is the way that you see Luke as a response to Matthew. And this seems to be like particularly the way that you're aware of the details, and anybody who's preached during Advent, is like, you're going to be working through, okay, where are we going to go this year? Matthew or Luke, or we're going to be more philosophical, go with John. But like you see this as a definite, almost like, and I think you use a language one time as a midrash. So I'm curious that this thought, and like, does it even extend beyond these boyhood narratives?
Yes. So looking at Luke 1-2, which I see as separate from the rest of Luke, I see the composition history of Luke Acts as quite complex, actually. So what we have is a final version of a complex history of putting Luke Acts together. But if we just think about Luke, it's been long understood that Luke 1-2 is a very separate style of Greek to the rest of Luke. It's very much like the Greek Septuagint. It's trying to do something just in terms of its language to give us a sense of, this is the sort of story that we expect from the birth of Samson or Samuel, or it's a prophetic type story. It weaves in already something else from the John the Baptist tradition. And it's answering questions, I think, that arise from Matthew. Matthew's story is written for people who are already quite in the know about Judea. You don't have to introduce Herod, what kind of king he was, what the Romans were up to with Herod. He's just like, oh, bad King Herod, here he is. Yeah. He's doing this thing. But Luke answers questions like, what's the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus? And so there it is, that the relationship is really understood. Or why is Jesus called a Nazarene? Why did Jesus' family go to Nazareth at all? Why don't they just stay in Bethlehem? And the story is, well, they were already in Nazareth. They already had some business in Nazareth, and they could. Maybe it was where Mary was from. This is why they went to Nazareth. If you think about the kind of questions you might have after reading Matthew, Luke answers them. Questions even like, there's not a lot said about Jesus and Judeans in Matthew. All the Judeans are quite bad, and Jesus and his family flee to Egypt for safety. But in Luke, there are a lot of good Judeans. There's prophetic utterances in the temple with Simeon and Anna, and there's a real connection with Judean customs, Jewish customs, and we're getting much more of the sort of things fed in from the Septuagint about what might have been appropriate for someone born at that time. So I see it as a response to Matthew's story, Luke 1-2.
Yeah. It's a very interesting chapter. You know, thinking back on the Matthew side, I think it's in the Matthew chapter where you bring up Celsus's argument that seeks to discredit Jesus's lineage. Pantera? Was that the idea that
the story of Pantera?
Yeah.
And that this is the first instance that we have in terms of the writings of Celsus. And somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century, Celsus wrote this enormous treatise against Christians and how awful they were. And he uses a character to argue against the Christians, argue against Jewish Christians, actually, Christian Jews. So he invents this Jewish character who argues against people of his own ethnicity who had followed Jesus. And it seems like he largely uses the Gospel of Matthew in this argument. But he also uses a particular story that was circulating in Jewish circles, that Jesus was the illegitimate son of this soldier called Panthera. And I say in the book, I follow the line of thinking that actually that's still, it's picking up from the kind of things that were said on the basis of the Gospel of Matthew, that Jesus was born of a virgin, because in Greek, it's Parthenos, the word for virgin, and Panthera sounds a little bit like Parthenos, and it's a kind of word play that they're doing. They're switching one letter around, and they're doing something with that, and that's quite a common thing that can happen in terms of storytelling, midrashic storytelling, Haggadic storytelling. So I think it's a Jewish response, kind of poking holes in a story that they knew the story of Matthew's account of the Nativity.
Yeah, very interesting. When I was working on Jude more, I was surprised. I found Richard Bauckham's earlier work, not just his commentary on Jude, but his work on Jesus's siblings. And you'll note this as well. But it's interesting to me to think about the types of sources that are used and seen in Jude, and then also what James says. And between those two books, which stand out in the New Testament for emphases, maybe even the way that they quote other intertestamental literature and ideas, the Assumption of Moses, the Enoch, various other things, that might give us a clue to what happened in Jesus's upbringing, his own education. So I'm curious if you resonate with that idea from Richard Bauckham.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. And I should have done. It makes me think I should have gone more into James and Jude. James being so interested in ethical lifestyle and ties in very much with the Gospel of Matthew. And Jude, whoa, all sorts eschatological stuff. Very short, very, very powerful. Letter. So yes, the sort of things that were being talked about in Jesus' family growing up, maybe, it's not something that we could just imagine as something coming from Jesus. I think Joseph already had a project. I see Joseph as really, really important in the upbringing of Jesus, that if we imagine that the stories of Jesus' birth come ultimately from Joseph. And they're saying, an angel arrived in a dream. Who could have told that story?
Yeah,
if
sure.
not
Nobody else
Joseph?
knows. Yeah.
No one else was there. But it's interpreting scripture through dreams. This was a kind of type of interpretation that Jews knew about. Josephus knows about. It's there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You think about your dreams and you think about scripture and you weave them together and you get an interpretation. Absolutely, that's how you read the signs of the times. I think that Joseph would have brought Jesus up and his other children up to think about scripture in a dynamic way of being a resource for understanding the crazy things that are happening in the world and around, and looking forward to a transformation that God was going to act in history, and being conscious of their Davidic lineage. So this is all part of Jesus' upbringing. It doesn't come from nowhere. The moment he sees John the Baptist and goes, boom, this is something that's happening to me. It's part of who he is from an early age. And the question for Jesus is really, what kind of call have I got? I think I want to write a book now much more about the adult Jesus, building on boy Jesus and thinking, this is the question, what kind of Messiah am I? What kind of king? If I'm called to be king, what does that actually mean? Because I don't want to be a king like Herod or the kings of this world. So this is the big question, I think, for the adult Jesus.
Yeah, N.T. Wright describes it as kind of this growing into his vocation.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that he sinned. It doesn't mean that any of the claims to divinity are any less from the Christian tradition, but that there could have been this maturation in his life. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. And
that's right. And as Luke says, exactly. And of course, all children do. And Jesus, I'm interested in Jesus as a human being, really all of the things that it means, the idea that Jesus knew exactly what he needed to do from the moment he was born and didn't have any doubts or uncertainties and knew everything, didn't need to learn anything, or, we've got the story of the Syrophoenician woman. He was still learning while he was on his mission. And being a teacher, I think, that's an incredible model, because being a teacher, you do also have to learn from your students. And Jesus wasn't just I'm telling you everything kind of guy. He could be very authoritative, but he was going to learn as well.
Yeah. Can we know anything of what happens from him being in the temple till the time his public ministry begins?
Well, that's a huge thing, isn't it? From 12 to whenever we date him in around 30, when he goes off on his public ministry. I think in terms of Nazareth, we can situate him in a small village. I don't think Nazareth was a particularly huge town. I think it was quite, one of the reasons I think Joseph chose Nazareth, or others from the Davidic line chose Nazareth, is because it was very well hidden. It's in a valley between hills all around. So the Romans wouldn't immediately see Nazareth. It was if you go to Nazareth, it's very nicely, it's surrounded by hills. But it's quite close to main highways as well, which is, of course, a danger, because Romans took their soldiers along, or Roman, I shouldn't say Romans so much. There were a few awful Roman incidents, but it was mainly Herod Antipas's army, and Herod Antipas was, of course, another Roman client ruler, son of Herod. But that life in Nazareth would have been the life of a small Galilean village, and Jesus was a carpenter, son of a carpenter, and he would have done his job, and he would have learnt his trade and have been helpful in the family and done his duties in the family and learnt from the synagogue and also learnt from his father. I think that is important as long as his father was alive. So everything that we know about Jesus in Nazareth, we have to construct from a kind of standard model of what we expect Galilean village life to be. And there's been some wonderful explorations of that. Jonathan Reed, Crossan, all sorts of people have explored Galilee to give us a context of what life was like for Jesus growing up there.
I'm sure with the title of one of your books being, let me just make sure I get it right. What did Jesus look like? Imagine if you had that book in your hands and you're in an elevator and somebody sees, and you say, actually, I wrote this book. And then you just have another 20, 30 seconds and they say to you, well, what's the answer? Now, one answer would be read the book, but how would you answer that question then? What did Jesus look like? Of course, there's all sorts of perceptions that are brought on of what people have imagined, but this is a question that's often raised, and I've been a part of a congregation where this was a significant issue because there was a portrait of Jesus that was very important to that congregation, and much of, I'll say, their identity was kind of caught up in that particular portrait. And so taking that portrait down was taking something of them down. And so so the question inevitably came, and then you have people who are not necessarily scholars, not at all scholars, trying to answer this question. And it's a difficult question. I'm just curious if you could give us a short version.
No, I mean, to the skeptical person, that elevator pitch, probably turn to the end of the book and have a look at the picture that I drew of a standard Judean man at the time, which some people say, oh, that's Jesus. But I was trying to get all of the clothing correct and the sort of thing that we would know about Jesus correct, and fairly short hair, not super long hair, because you got lice and you had to be careful in the ancient world. We found a lot of lice combs from ancient Judea, and they had to get lice out of their hair if it grew long. So if you have a long-haired Jesus, do you really want a lice-haired Jesus? You know? And but bearded, yes, and representations of Judean men in coins show them with kind of hair around their ears and bearded. So yeah, probably Middle Eastern appearance, short tunic, because that was what men wore at that time. Jesus said, beware of men walking around in long robes, because only very, very wealthy men wore long robes. So please not a long robe Jesus, and please a Middle Eastern Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, what a great short answer. That's amazing. When people ask you to summarize a whole book in years of research, and you did it. Thank you. Thanks for taking on that challenge. One thing I enjoyed at the very end of your book, I thought that this is kind of it's not quite the last line, but it's almost there. It's very close to being your last line. And second to last paragraph, when you're talking about, I thought this is such a nice way of ending, the Jesus being in the temple. Despite everything, Jesus was in the end a good boy. I feel like, wow, that should have been that could have been the last line, but I thought it was so good. Like, of course, that comes in the context of highlighting him being lost and those type of things and his interaction with his mother. So I really enjoyed this book, and I'm thankful for your work as a historian and New Testament scholar, bringing us some light on this theme, which I think, as I said at the very beginning, is a question that many people have. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this book or your research?
Oh, no. Well, thank you so much for all your questions, Andy. I've enjoyed talking with you.
You too. Let me ask one more question, unrelated. My podcast is called More to the Story. And so obviously I want to get a little deeper in than say just a short conversation. We have about an hour long here. But also, is there more to the story of Joan? I see you have you're active online, done various talks, places. But is there something like a hobby or something that you have that you could share with us that's different?
Oh, well, I don't know if it's a hobby. I'm also a creative writer. So I write poetry. I've written some novels. I'm writing some short stories at the moment. I love that side of writing as well. It's a totally different part of my brain to historical academic study, but yeah, creative writing is important to me.
Have you ever done like a historical fiction around the time of Jesus or that type of thing?
Do you know, I have written a novel of Jesus, but I've kind of put it away because it's one of those things that so many people have done.
Yeah.
And I think, well, what on earth could mine add? And I don't know. If I took it out of the drawer again, I'd have to really rewrite it, I think, because I'm learning all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Well, that'd be a fun thing to see sometime. Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for your time. It means a lot to me that you're here. I hope people can check out this book, Boy Jesus, published by Zondervan, just come out recently here. Love for everybody to check that out. You can find a link to it in my show notes. Joan, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.